Now that you know about the basic styles created in the beginning half of the century, let's talk a little bit about the classical music styles formed after 1945. There's such diversity in classical music after 1945 that it's impossible for us to discuss and listen to every type of music discovered and created in this period. You know already that in the first half of the century, classical music expanded in both sound, idea, it expanded in definition, and it challenged listeners to be deeply affected by the music they were listening to. After 1945, this trend continues to the point that today every classical composer writes in their own new style. Music has truly become individualized. And as I've said, there are too many new types of forms for us to learn about or listen to. So, we're going to, in this particular lecture, define a few of the new styles and forms of this last 60 to 70 years so that you know they exist, but I'm not going to require you to listen to examples of these forms. I want you to simply understand what they are, know that they exist as more popularized forms of classical music, but are still little known, even though they're very, very important to how music develops in the last 70 years. A few of the most important trends from 1950, about 1945 on, chance music, minimalism, and electronic music, will be covered in the last 3 separate lectures and will end this week's material. As I've said, there's tons of new styles that develop after 1945, and one of them is based off of this 12-tone atonal system of music that we've already discussed in many different contexts that was created by Arnold Schoenberg. The new type of music that was developed after 1945 based on this system was called serialism. Serialism is a system of music in which everything is organized: rhythm, dynamics, tone color, and pitches. When you think of 12-tone music, it is only the use of 12 different pitches on equal levels, not an organizational system related to anything other than pitches. Serialism is a system organizing all elements of music in a mathematical, very controlled environment. Some composers really wanted to control every aspect of music. If you look at a piece of music that is a serialist composition, every single note will be one of the 12 pitches in a row, and they will never repeat until all 12 pitches have been heard. Then you'll see different variations of this 12-tone set or row of notes. Sometimes the composer will use it backwards or upside down. Sometimes he will lengthen the notes. But every single rhythm, dynamic, pitch, and tone colors even is controlled in this mathematical way. This music is often very difficult to listen to, and it's hard to hear how the music is actually created. It's hard to hear the intention of the composer. It sounds to most listeners like randomness, but it is very, very controlled. Some of the best composers of serialist music are Milton Babbitt, Pierre Boulez, and Karlheinz Stockhausen. Feel free to look up their music and see whether when you listen to it, it makes sense to you or not. Each of these men wanted to control music completely, since they hated the randomness of life and the loss of control that humanity experienced in the world wars. This was really a system that developed after the Second World War because composers felt that they needed to control everything that they could, since they could not control human beings. Another new style is a style called musical quotation. We've already talked about this, even though you don't know it, a little bit, because Charles Ives was one of the first composers to invent this form. He didn't use it in the same way that composers after 1945 did, but he was one of the first American composers to ever use quotations or little snippets of songs in his music that he did not himself write. We've talked about the fact that even Mozart stole melodies to use in his music. But after 1945, this style of music, stealing quotations of music, really had a new point. Composers were trying to communicate in a new way with audiences and teach them how to listen to music. They wanted to see whether they could get an audience to understand music better and captivate them more, teach them how to hear the different aspects and elements of music by creating music that used popular and other types of folk music that they already knew in strange forms of classical music. So they would combine their own musical styles, whatever they may be, expressionist, impressionist, American art music, with melodies of other composers that were already known to the common man, so that listeners could try and find a connection with the work, but still be challenged to listen to different styles. It was a very interesting innovation on Charles Ives' original idea and on what Mozart did in the classical period. After 1945, almost all composers used this idea of musical quotation, and today it's used a lot in electronic music because a lot of popular artists and electronic artists sample music. That's exactly what music quotation music in the classical realm is. Something else that was really interesting about musical style after 1945 is that there were so many composers born around the turn of the century to a time when music had no tonality, no key, no balance, that some composers after the World Wars returned to tonality as a new idea. They had never really studied or heard or appreciated music from the Romantic period, the Classical period, or the Baroque, and didn't even really truly understand popularized music. So, since all they'd ever heard was atonal music, strange, bizarre, expressionist music, they reacted violently against these trends and returned to a sense of normalcy. They grew tired of the atonal sound and returned to tonality and balance. This generation of composers was called the New Romantics because they still had a more modern sound, they used more modern techniques, but they wanted melody and beauty to return, and so they had a sense of balance and tonality in their music. Almost all composers after 1945 or at one point dabble in the idea of returning to tonality. Whether they stay in that tonality or not is really the question, because many composers grew bored very easily when they returned to tonality. So they would write a few pieces in this style, and then they would turn to what other strange modern style they were writing in. We've already talked about the fact that rhythm and form were used in different ways in the 20th century. After 1945, composers really decided that rhythm was much more important in many ways than melody or harmony. Stravinsky, of course, with his primitivism, emphasized rhythm. But composers after 1945 went much further. Take a look at the picture to the right. This is an example of a modern classical music score. Even the staff of music, the musical lines, the notes, they do not exist anymore for many composers in the normal notation. Instead, rhythm became about how long notes were held in minutes, in timed durations. Music was allowed to unfold rather than follow any rules, and it was given up to random chance many times. They decided that normal notation for rhythm and form was not really appropriate in a more modern period where music was supposed to be free and where music could be made in any possible way. If you really look at this score of music you see one page of here, try to imagine how you might perform something like this. There's no set instrumentation, no timing other than the differences in size of the circle and the lines connecting the notes. What do they even mean? How do you perform a piece of music like this? It's really up to the discretion of the performer, since the composer has left so many things up to the performer and how they interpret the score. The rhythm of this piece of music, for example, is very open to interpretation since, again, it's about the proportion of the circles, the dots, the notes, the lines. How does it all fit together? After 1945, sometimes music is so much left up to the chance and the idea that the composer doesn't control rhythm and form, that music itself never sounds the same twice. These are only a handful of the new styles and ideas expressed by classical composers over the past 75 years, but they're some of the largest trends. The other ones, minimalism, chance music, and electronic music, we're going to talk about very briefly in the next 3 lectures. As I've said already a few times, feel free to read further about these concepts by reading the sections of Part 6 in your text not required in this week's reading. You do have to read about these forms in the reading, and that part of the reading is covered on the exam. However, there are other parts and other chapters in Part 6 that describe specific pieces of music that use these ideas, and then describe how they use different elements in creating these styles. There are also a few sections on new composers that write in these styles. So feel free to read about that if you're interested in these, and feel free to go find some interesting listening examples for yourself. So now let's move on to the three most popularized classical styles after 1945. These are very important styles because they really do try to bridge the gap between the classical modern styles and popular styles. They try to take music to the next level, and they really try to finally help us understand and define what music truly is.